just have a question about what the Catholic position is on Sola Scriptura.
Yeah.
That's how you pronounce it, sorry.
What a great question. I really appreciate this. So the doctrine of Sola Scriptura, which, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, I'll give you my understanding of the doctrine. The doctrine of Sola Scriptura is that no article of faith can be proposed for belief unless it can be established by the express words of the Bible. And thus, the Bible is the sole rule of faith for the church. If someone proposes, well, you ought to believe this, they should be able to establish that from the express testimony of the Bible. Otherwise, it cannot be proposed as an article of faith.
Like the Bible has the last word.
It's got the last word specifically on the content of faith and practice in the Christian life, right? So that doctrine emerged really in its kind of fully formed way in the year 1519 in a debate between Martin Luther and John Eck. John Eck was a Catholic polemicist, and he was debating Luther on some of Luther's doctrines. And in the context of that debate, Eck demonstrated that some of Luther's positions had already been condemned by church councils, in particular the Council of Constance in 1415. And Luther conceded the point. He admitted, you're correct. The council has already condemned some of my positions, but I reject the council. I reject the authority of the council. I will stand on the Bible alone. That was Luther's rhetorical response. And the context would seem to indicate that this was a kind of rhetorical move on Luther's part in response to a public debate. It doesn't seem to have been a completely worked out theory of the authority of the Bible. Later Protestant theologians attempted to justify that position and say, well, here's the reason why that's a reasonable position to take. Now, the first thing I note as a Catholic looking at that doctrine is let's apply the test of the doctrine to itself. No article of faith can be proposed for belief unless it can be established by the express testimony of Scripture. Okay, is the doctrine of Sola Scriptura an article of faith in the Christian religion? Should it be proposed as an article of faith? Christians ought to believe in the doctrine of Sola Scriptura. Well, to apply the Protestant test, we should see if the doctrine can be established by the express testimony of the Bible. So what would we need to find in the Bible? Well, first thing we would need to find in the Bible is a list of biblical books. And that's the way the doctrine is stated. If you find it in confessions of faith in the Protestant tradition, say the Westminster Confession of Faith, for example, of the Presbyterians, they'll say, here is the list of biblical books, Genesis to Revelation, and they typically leave out the 7 deuterocanonical texts of the Catholic Church. So here are these books. These are the ones, this stuff is the rule of faith. So we ought to find in the Bible, first of all, a list of biblical books declared to be inspired and infallible by God. Then we should find instruction in the Bible saying, these are the rule of faith. When you have a question about the content of Christian faith or practice, you should advert to these books and nothing else. Or at least these books definitively. Do we find either of those affirmations in the Bible? We do not. There is no place in the Bible that says, here's the list of biblical books. There's no inspired table of contents that comes along with the Bible. Secondly, nowhere in Scripture does Scripture point to itself as the rule of faith. And so, just logically, it seems that the doctrine fails its own test and is philosophically incoherent. I also note that it is a novelty. It really only emerges in its current form in 1519. Well, we got 1,500 years of church history prior to that, when Christians who were deeply devoted to the Bible and its teaching and lived by the Bible never came up with this doctrine because the Bible itself did not suggest it. So it's got some problems. Now, Protestants will often say, they'll point to passages of Scripture, say, for example, in the Gospels, where Jesus quotes the Old Testament authoritatively, in contrast to Jewish tradition. And they say, aha, see, here this is Bible versus tradition. And as a Catholic, I look at that and I say, well, I'm completely on board with Jesus. The Old Testament is definitely authoritative. Catholics regard the Bible as authoritative, just not comprehensively authoritative.
Mm-hmm.
It's authoritative to be sure. And we don't follow Jewish tradition. I mean, like, we respect it. We respect Jewish tradition and the rabbis and the Talmud and all that, but that's not the rule of faith for the church. I'm not going to do something because the Talmud says so, right? Unless it's accord with natural law and reason, right? I might, but not got no particular jurisdiction over the Christian's life. So I agree with Jesus about that, all right? But there's another peculiarity about the way Christ engages the Old Testament. He doesn't take it at face value at all. At all. He does not take it sort of as the man on the street would understand it. I'll give you an example. The Old Testament says you should stone adulterers. If you find somebody committing adultery, take them out and stone them to death. There it is in black and white. The Pharisees knew that. So they approached Christ. John chapter 8 said, we caught this woman in adultery. Let's start gathering rocks. Jesus says, not going to do it. We're not taking the Bible at face value like that. Same thing with the Mosaic law on divorce. Rather, Christ imports a different criterion of his own authority and the higher law of charity and the creation ordinance and all kinds of principles to interpret the Bible that the Bible itself does not suggest. These are the Old Testament does not suggest. These are hermeneutical principles interior to Christ's own life that he brings as uniquely authoritative. St. Paul, when he engages the Old Testament in the first and second letter to the Corinthians and also in Galatians, says that this Christian hermeneutic, this way of reading the Old Testament, not as it stands, not as the man on the street says about it. And how do you do that? Well, Paul says the way you have the mind of Christ is through baptism and growth in charity, which requires unity with the church. That's what Paul says. You have to die with Christ in baptism, be reborn. Baptism is the rite of entrance into the people of God, which is the church. And then, and even then, you're not all the way there, because if you have factions with one another, Paul says in Corinthians, you don't yet have the mind of Christ. Mm-hmm. You have to actually agree with one another, live in Christian charity, and not separate into factionalism and sectionalism in order to have the mind of Christ. So unity with the church is integral to being able to read the Bible the right way. All that is in St. Paul's teaching. So the Bible itself teaches us positively that the Bible alone is not sufficient. You need to be in union with the church. And Christ, when he made provision for handing on the faith, he didn't say, go to the Bible. He said, thou art Peter. Mm-hmm. And on this rock I will build my church. And I give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. I will be with you to the end of the age. Christ actually gave us the teaching church as the authoritative way of handing on the Christian faith. The Bible is an inspired witness to the life of Christ and the apostles and the prophets, and it's filled with edification and prayer, and it's a source for theological reflection, and is integral to the Christian's life, but not as a rule of faith.
Okay, Elizabeth, is that helpful for you?
Yes, it is. Thank you.